Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Anneli Jefferson about instrumentalist accounts of moral responsibility and some challenges, including issues related to blaming the dead.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Anneli Jefferson, who is a lecturer at Cardiff University. Anneli's research focuses on moral responsibility, moral psychology, and the philosophy of psychology and psychiatry. She's the author of a book called Our Mental Disorders, Brain Disorders, published by Routledge in 2022, as well as many articles and book chapters that will be of interest to our listeners, two of which we'll talk about today. The first is Instrumentalism About Moral Responsibility Revisited, published in Philosophical Quarterly in 2019. And the second is Blaming the Dead, which is in European Journal of Philosophy and has just been made available online earlier this year, and it's open access, so people should check that out. Welcome to the show, Anneli. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to moral responsibility?
Yes. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm very flattered and grateful to be able to have the opportunity to talk about my work. So I have always been interested in moral philosophy, even though I did my PhD in philosophy psychology. And in my first postdoc, after finishing my PhD, I worked in an Institute for Neuroscience and Medicine. And in that context, I started looking at moral responsibility and mental illness and also brain disorders. And how those two go together. And that's then spread to a more general interest in moral responsibility. Also, obviously, if you're going to start writing about moral responsibility, you need to decide how to approach it from a theoretical perspective. And that's kind of what the papers that we're going to be referencing today are on, where I outline where I'm coming from in terms of moral responsibility. And it's very much a sort of practice-first approach rather than a metaphysics-first approach.
Right.
Yeah. And speaking of which, in some of your work, you've defended an instrumentalist account of moral responsibility. So could you explain what instrumentalism is and how it differs from other types of accounts of moral responsibility?
Yes, I think sort of for somebody who's new to the area, the easiest way into thinking about these things is if you think about theories of punishment, even though that's not quite the same thing. But in theories of punishment, we kind of have two main approaches. One is retributivism and one is consequentialism.
Yeah.
And retributivism, and I'm not going to do a very good job at explaining retributivism because I'm not a retributivist. So I'm missing some of the key intuitions, but I'll try to give it a fair hearing. And so the idea with retributivism is that it's justified to punish somebody in the criminal context purely on the basis that they deserve it. So even, and there's a thought experiment by Michael Moore about this, even if the world's going to end tomorrow and nothing good could come from it, it would still be justified and make sense to punish a wrongdoer because they deserve it. So that is retributivism. And consequentialism says, well, actually, if we're going to create more suffering, if we're going to have hard treatment for somebody, even if they're a horrible person and they've done something horrible, it needs to have some kind of benefit. And then what kind of benefit that is will vary, and in the legal system, but also, as we'll see in moral philosophy, there's kind of two ways of looking at it. One is sort of looking at what does it do for the wrongdoer? Is it going to morally improve them? And what is it going to do for society more generally? So you have the idea of deterrence, for example, in the criminal system, where of general deterrence, where the idea is if we know that a certain behavior is penalized in a certain way, then we're less likely to do it ourselves. So those are kind of the two main approaches to punishment, but also blame, I would say. And obviously there's hybrid versions, and everything isn't always as pure as it sounds in this sort of cartoon version that I'm giving you. And so in moral responsibility theory more generally, you in instrumentalist account will say what justifies blame and holding responsible, but also praise, but somehow we're kind of more focused on blame because it hurts more and we feel a stronger need to justify it, is that it's got good effects, and these effects are supposed to be on the agent. And then you can kind of separate out different strands of instrumentalism depending on who your main focus is. And that, once again, parallels the legal discussion, because you might be most strongly focused on the wrongdoer. And I think in contrast to the legal discussion, in the moral responsibility discussion, the focus has been more strongly on the wrongdoer. That they can change if they're held responsible, or you're reinforcing good behavior by praising. But, and this is quite important, you could also be looking at the moral community more generally and see what the effect is on people who live in that community to have that kind of practice of holding each other to account and being seen to hold each other to account. So one favorite example of mine is I used to be a school teacher for a very short time before I went back to do my PhD. And if you think about a classroom teacher punishing somebody who's been noisy or badly behaved, that's almost always more strongly directed at the classroom to set the rules than at that individual wrongdoer. And I think that's kind of a nice example that we're all familiar from earlier days, to see how the community effect is important as well for a lot of instruments.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a helpful example. So what are some examples of earlier instrumentalist accounts of moral responsibility, and what are some common objections to them or to instrumentalism in general?
Yes. So instrumentalism is a theory that lots of people really don't like, as in,
Right.
and especially early instrumentalism. So two examples of more earlier instrumentalism are smart, and I think that's the reference point for a lot of philosophers who work in this area today. Slightly less well known for that is Moritz Schlick, from logical positivism. He also has this idea that responsibility is really all about when we say somebody's responsible, then what we're saying is that they can be affected by being blamed or punished. And this brings me to a second thing that I need to say, because it's quite important, because instrumentalist theories vary on that front. So I've been talking in the first question about what justifies punishment, blame, praise. A related question, and that's one thing that we see in Smart a lot and also in Schlick, is what makes somebody a responsible agent. And in some instrumentalist accounts, but not in all, those things come as a package. So for Smart, the idea is, when we're thinking about free will and about moral responsibility, what we're thinking about is really, are you malleable enough to be influenced by being held responsible? And he kind of says that's kind of as much as we need in terms of freedom and in terms of justifying holding people responsible. So that means that it's not just the case that you say we justify holding responsible by the effect. We also say that even goes one step further. It gives us what it is to be a responsible agent. You need to be the kind of person who's in principle able to be affected by being held responsible. And that's been something that a lot of people have reacted against. I think the thing that people have reacted against more in Smart was that they felt it was quite crude. And I think we're going to be talking about criticisms later, so I won't get them all in here.
Okay.
And just in terms of these two aspects of instrumentalism, some instrumentalists only think that the justification for holding responsible should be instrumentalist or consequentialist, and some people think that also feeds into what it takes to be a responsible agent. So, for example, Manuel Vargas only just does the justification of our practices via instrumentalism, and other than that goes for reasons responsiveness account, which I'm sure you will have covered in earlier episodes.
Yeah.
And while I think reasons responsiveness is important as well. I also take this influenceability as being crucial for being a responsible agent, as does Victoria McGeer, probably some other people that I can't think of at the moment as
Yeah.
well.
You argued that consequentialist considerations are central to the justification of our moral responsibility practices. But unlike other instrumentalists, you see a role for what P.F. Strawson calls the reactive attitudes. So, could you tell us a little bit more about the details of your view and what sets your account apart from other versions of instrumentalism?
Yes. So what I'm going to do to start out with is just see how Strawson is often seen in relation to instrumentalism, and also how he saw himself, because he actually talks about utilitarian approaches to responsibility, and he's not very nice to them. So
Right.
it's quite interesting because when I first read Strawson, famous paper Freedom and Resentment, I kind of took him to be a consequentialist about responsibility. And then I was told, no, 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 that's wrong. I have seen that I'm not the only one who thinks that. But it is because he's sort of a bit ambivalent. So, because what he says is against the utilitarians and the consequentialists about punishment and responsibility is that he says it doesn't get the phenomenology of what we're doing when we're blaming right. Because as you mentioned in your question, Strawson thinks that what's central when we hold people responsible is our reactive attitudes, sort of resentment, gratitude, and all these things where you have an emotional reaction to the way somebody is treating you. And he thinks that's central to responsibility and blame. And he also thinks that's backward looking. And that's why he thinks pure consequentialists don't work, because he says it's a one-eyed utilitarianism which only looks at the future and sort of doesn't really do justice to the whole package that we have. But the reason why you can also see a consequentialism in there is because he also says we can't give up on our responsibility practices. That still sounds like maybe a transcendental argument or something like that. But he also says we wouldn't want to. He says it's central for our ways of living together, and we wouldn't give them up even if we could.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so, in what we have in Smart is that he doesn't react directly to Strawson, but he has a problem with judgmental blame explicitly in his work. He says, well, punishment is fine, but we shouldn't sort of have all these negative attitudes to people who are wrongdoers. And since then, we've kind of, I would say, tried to get some Strawson in there into instrumentalist accounts. And because it's just true that when we're blaming somebody, we're not sort of doing the maths. It's not always
Right.
true, actually.
Mhm.
Um, sometimes we do the maths. And sometimes we do, like, I always remember a case, and I was working on responsibility at the time, where I was annoyed at a friend who was always late. But I kind of know that that friend is always late, and was, should I blame her and call her out or not? All my friends who listen to this will now wonder whether it's them, but let's not worry about that. And I decided, no, I'm gonna call that person out, just because it's a way of sort of negotiating what's acceptable behavior in that relationship, and taking these kinds of things into an instrumentalist account means that what you have to then do is go more indirect than your classic instrumentalist account. But we're kind of used to that from lots of different consequentialist thinking. So if you think about the paradox of happiness, where the idea is that if you directly aim at happiness, you normally don't quite get it. And therefore, it shouldn't be the goal that you have explicitly in mind all the time. Um, this is sort of a similar suggestion for moral responsibility theory. And another person who's developed this very well is Victoria McGeer. So I would also recommend people looking at her work if they're attracted to this way of thinking about responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's kind of how you get Strawson in there. You have to go more indirect. But I think you have to go more indirect anyway, because it's impossible to always calculate the effects of what our resentment is going to do. And this also, shall I say some more about this, because I
Oh yeah.
this could go on for a while. So one thing that is informative there is once again the parallel to legal theory. So H.A. Hart says that the justification for punishment generally is forward-looking,
Right.
consequentialist. But he says when we're looking at individual cases, we have to be backward-looking. And we have a similar line of thought in Rawls as well, in the paper, what's it called, Two Concepts of a Rule, where he looks at where we would get to if we started thinking about whether it makes most sense to apply the rules in this case in a forward-looking, in a specific case in a forward-looking way. So the general idea that we have there is that even if what justifies the practice generally is what it gets us, that doesn't mean that the phenomenology and the practice in individual cases should be forward-looking. And I think it's also worthwhile distinguishing between the general justification and the psychological processes in the individual case. And the justification holds if the effects are the right ones, even if the psychological processes aren't aiming at that effect.
Right.
I mean, there is a larger problem of what we should do if we then start worrying that the effects aren't the ones that we are hoping, because then
Right.
we might have to try and fiddle with the psychology, and we can maybe talk about that later.
Mm-hmm. Well, another thing we're going to talk about later, as I mentioned earlier, is a sort of challenge to your account concerning blaming the dead. But setting that aside for just a minute, are there any other common objections to instrumentalism that your account can address?
Yes, well, I mean, I thought there were when I started writing on this, and then over time you're less sure. So there's one thing that I think it can address, but I'm not sure that everybody agrees that the outcome that I come to is a good outcome. So I'll tell you, and you can judge for yourself whether this is where you want to go. Because one thing that we have as an outcome of the strong link between being influenceable
Mm-hmm.
and being a responsible agent is that it follows from that somebody who is not influenceable at all is not a responsible agent, and therefore at least our normal forms of blame aren't appropriate, because it's not about how bad they are, it's about what blame will achieve. And there's then the question of if somebody is so evil that they cannot be changed, should we still be holding them responsible? Is that justified? On my account, it isn't. I think this is a good thing. But I also, because it's a pointless exercise, right? Unless you, and I suppose here we come to a clash of intuitions, unless you think it's just good that they suffer because they've caused suffering, then you're back to the retributive intuition, and I just don't share that in the same way. Though I can see how if you're the person harmed, you might have that more strongly. I should just say what that doesn't imply is that we should just let people who are not influenceable get on with it. I mean, obviously, the legal system then needs to do something. And there's a live empirical debate about whether psychopaths or extreme psychopaths fall under the category of people who aren't influenceable in that way. And I don't think that that's true. I think there's enough evidence that there is still a possibility of influence. But if it were true, then it would follow from my account that they aren't responsible agents.
Mm-hmm.
So then you can also there see how the sort of the empirical questions and the moral questions interact.
Mm-hmm. Could I ask a follow up here about praise again? And it's a little odd to me to think about influence, ability, and praiseworthiness, but maybe I'm just missing some of the picture. Like, I could see how someone who's so evil that they're not influenceable anymore, I could see how, yeah, if you've got retributivist leanings, you might still think, oh, they deserve some blame, they deserve to suffer a little bit. But then maybe I can also see your side of things, like, well, what's the point of this exercise if they're not going to change at all? But then compare that with someone who's very, very good, and maybe they've made themselves that way, maybe not. That might change whether you think they're influenceable or not. But suppose they're not influenceable anymore and they're still doing good things. Do you think praise and gratitude and other forms of praise make sense for someone like that?
Yes, but it sort of fits really well because it also widens the picture a bit. So first of all, for that particular agent, because this has come up in various sort of criticisms of Instrumentalist account, that the sort of the kind of agent that we are aiming for is one who wouldn't need praise anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that in a way, if we think of this as the scaffold for responsibility, doesn't that mean like that we're working with the wrong image of human agency, which is always dependent on external reinforcement?
Right.
So first of all, I would say yes. I don't think that ever goes away. So my interest in moral psychology is such that
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't mean that you have to be constantly praised, but I do think, or in fact blamed, because the better you get, right, the less blame there will be. But
Mm-hmm.
I think sort of being aware of the potential for praise and blame, and taking that as sort of a bit of a shorthand also of your effect on others, and your that you have to be justifiable to others. Is that a right way of putting it? You know, you have to be in
Mm-hmm.
a position where you can justify your actions to others, especially others with less power. Um, I don't think that ever goes away. So a lot of it might become internalized, and you might not be dependent on a day-to-day basis on people praising or blaming you. Might still be nice though, right? I mean,
Right.
imagine like nobody praises you anymore because that's just what they expect of you. It's
Right.
a bit sad.
Yeah.
Um,
You might want to thank you every now and then. Yeah.
yeah. So, and then, oh yes, I was wanting to widen the picture.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that it's important for the other aspect that I mentioned earlier, that you have the moral community as well. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet is the praiser or blamer themselves, because you've got the person
Mhm.
being blamed, you've got what you might broadly call the audience, the bystanders, and then you've got
Mm-hmm.
the person doing the praising and the blaming. And one thing that praising and blaming does for you is that it sort of signals where you stand, both to yourself and to others. But I think it's also important to yourself, for yourself, and for expressing and reinforcing your own moral values and stance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Nice.
All right. So people who are not influenceable anymore can't be blameworthy. And so this implication seems to suggest a challenge related to blaming the dead. So, how can it be appropriate to blame the dead if the dead can't be improved anymore? Could you explain this challenge and how you respond?
Yeah, good. So this has been like an ongoing challenge to consequentialist accounts. So you get somebody complaining about Schlick's account,
Mm-hmm.
saying, "But when we blame somebody and they've been dead for 200 years, we're not trying to change what they've done. We can't change what they're doing. They're not acting anymore." So that it just misdescribes what's going on. That's the word.
Right.
And I think that's kind of two problems, because, as I said earlier, there's two aspects to the instrumentalist view of the kind that I endorse. One is, what does it take to be a responsible agent? And I think that's what you were picking up on when you were voicing or expressing the criticism. Basically, somebody who's dead can't be influenced anymore, can therefore not be a responsible agent anymore, so they're not the right target. But also, if we think what justifies blame, then what we are trying to do, which is to change them, is also not going to happen anymore because they're
Right.
dead. So it seems both the is it a responsible agent question and does the justification apply seem to sort of fail at first glance. And I'm less worried about the first one because I think to some extent everything changes when somebody's dead, right? Because it's not just that they're not a responsible agent anymore, they don't exist anymore, right? So I would just say with that, well, what we're interested in is, was this person a responsible agent when they were alive? The kind of person who would have been able to understand criticism, react to criticism, take on board criticism, and so on and so forth. So I'm not so worried about that one. But the second one is obviously an interesting one because you're not going to affect any change in that individual by saying, oh my goodness, why did he do that? He is such a terrible person. And I try sort of a rather roundabout way of resolving that in the earlier paper that we talked about, where I said, well, maybe what is going on is that because we blame the dead generally, and people know that, it makes them think about what they're doing now because they don't want to be blamed once they're dead. But I've since come to the conclusion that that just isn't what's going on when we blame the dead, because very often what's going on when we blame the dead is that it just doesn't look like the right kind of activity, and sometimes we blame them for things that people don't even do anymore. So it doesn't look like we're trying to discourage people from doing the kind of thing that that person did. So one person I talk about in the Blaming the Dead paper is Edward Colston. There was a lot of conversation and a lot of movement to have the statue of him and also street names and, like all these honors taken away in Bristol. And in the course of the Black Lives Matter protest, a statue of his was torn down and dumped into Bristol Harbour. And it's not like people were doing that because they wanted to warn people here and now off the transatlantic slave trade. That is just not plausible. And also, if you look at the context, it was very much about racism and the after effects of all the things that happened several hundred years ago. And so I've increasingly come to the conclusion that it's really about negotiating values here and now. And I think it's important that what that person did that we're reacting against in these forms of blame or protest is in some way related to things that we care about here and now. But I don't think it's the case that we're trying to influence that person. We're trying to solve our present day problems and negotiate our present day values when we're doing that. And Shoemaker and Vargas in a paper from recently say that blaming the dead is really all about the living. I don't agree with that completely, and I'll say why in a minute. But I think there's something to that a lot of the time it's about issues that are live now. And then it is very much about moral influence and trying to change people's minds and signaling what we stand for. The reason I don't think that always works is because I do think that there's cases which are much more directed at the actual deceased individual, and those are more likely to be cases where we knew that person personally and they were possibly close to us. And the example that I use in my paper is from a novel, and it's about a woman who, after her husband's death, finds out that he was serially unfaithful to her. And she's really angry, and she writes in her diary, and she writes, I blame him, and I can't express it to him, and I cannot have this conversation, and I can only write it down in my diary. And I think that's a different kind of blame, and it's much less of a sort of community norm negotiation blame, and much more of a wanting to address that individual and not being able to because they're dead.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've talked about some cases where there is a basis for blaming the dead. Are there any cases in which, on your view, blaming the dead would be inappropriate or unjustified?
Yes. So it's a bit of a tricky one. So I'll talk you through a few different scenarios. So one thing that's always interesting, irrespective of what kind of blame we talk about, whether it's for the dead or for other people, is that once you start looking at cases, they start looking shockingly different from each other. So you think, oh,
Mm-hmm.
I've got an account of this, and then you look at what people are doing in actual scenarios, and it doesn't look like they're doing the same thing.
Right.
So one one case where I think it's kind of inappropriate. Well, when not inappropriate, it's kind of pointless, but I also think it doesn't happen that much for that reason is when there is no current victim of that is in some way or other related to the wrongdoing. So I was thinking of Aristotle actually and his justification of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, yeah, we don't really like. We'd prefer if he hadn't written that. Um,
Right.
but most of us also don't tend to get particularly outraged about that. Compare that to Kant and Hume, who've also
Mm-hmm.
written dodgy things, where people get quite exercised today, especially over
Right.
the last 5 years. And why is
Yeah.
that? Well, it's because we don't really have an obvious demographic that suffers from what Aristotle did there. So I wouldn't say it's like terrible if we blame Aristotle, but I don't think it does much for anybody. So inappropriate, pointless, maybe that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Here's another one that I've been thinking about, and it's a bit tricky because it gets into a different issue to do with responsibility theory, which is when moral ignorance excuses. But let's go back to the examples of either slave traders or slave holders. And what you often hear when you talk to people about those kind of past wrongs is it was a different time. And then there's, at least in principle, the possibility that people didn't really understand that what they were doing was wrong. I mean, for some cases, that's very, very hard to imagine. But
Right.
for others, you could see slightly less obviously vicious scenarios um, where people might have just, through a combination of a distorted view of the people they were oppressing and not doing some of the most obviously atrocious things that cause physical harm, thought of what they were doing as morally justified and been reinforced in that idea by their environment. Now, then there's an in principle argument you could make that these people were not blameworthy at the time because they didn't understand the nature of their actions. Because normally, for responsibility, we have the control condition and the epistemic condition. And the epistemic condition is that you kind of need to understand what you're doing and also the moral quality of what you're doing, and that sometimes you can be non culpably ignorant of either some of the effects or of the moral status of what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of people who think that in environments where sexism or racism is endemic, there might be a form of non culpable moral ignorance. Okay, let's just assume for the sake of argument, and I'm not like asking you to necessarily buy that, but
Right.
you sort of, if that's sort of enough for you to think there's a chance that people at that time weren't responsible or didn't understand it and were non-culpably ignorant, then the question becomes, are we right to blame them now, given that they didn't know what they were doing. And some people say no, but I am not so sure, because what I think is that it's very, very hard to, and possibly dangerous, almost certainly dangerous, to give up our own current moral perspective in blaming. And especially in these cases of what we call moral ignorance, where what's at stake is understanding of wrongdoing rather than some factual questions. And there, the instrumentalist would once again be happy to say we can blame because we are asserting the norms that we've arrived at, hard fought, and we're not just going to roll back on that just
Hmm.
because they didn't know better at the time. But it is a difficult case. And I
Yeah.
think if you're going to make a case against posthumous blame for instrumental reasons, that might be one of the areas where it's promising. I have one more case where I think it's
Okay.
tricky, which is tricky for a very different reason. So sometimes people die, and once they die, all of a sudden, everybody comes out of the woodwork and criticizes them for things they've done in their lives. And in academia, you sometimes see this with sexual harassment type cases.
Yeah.
I'm sure you can think of somebody, I'm not going to name any names. Person X dies, and everybody, or a significant minority of people, say, well, they were a complete bastard anyway. Look at what they did there, there, and there.
Hmm.
The problem I have with that kind of case is not so much um, that person gets blamed posthumously, but that they weren't blamed prehumously while still alive. So sometimes I think blaming the dead becomes sort of a cheap shot, where you're doing it when it isn't costly anymore. And if you think the justification for blame is that you're standing your ground for values that you think are important and you're wanting to make a difference, if you're only doing that when it's much more easy than it would have been 3 weeks ago before that person died, especially if this is a powerful person, then I think there's certainly something unsavory about blaming the dead,
Yeah.
and not so much about because they're being blamed, but because they weren't being blamed earlier.
Yeah. That's a tricky case.
Yeah. Well, we've been focusing on blaming the dead, but are there any other challenges for your instrumentalist account?
Yes, lots. So this is a bad thing if you work on an account, right? The longer you work on it, the more
Well, maybe
problems you
it's a
see.
good thing because you have lots of fodder for more papers.
Well, that is true, yes. No, that is certainly the case. So I will just tell you about the one that worries me most at the moment, which I think is sort of an internal tension in instrumentalism that has come out in some of the things I've said already, but I'll just put it front and center now, which is the instrumentalization worry. So, what is the instrumentalization worry? Well, it's a general worry about consequentialism, whether it's consequentialism about responsibility or consequentialism more generally, which is that you can sort of use the one in order to benefit the many. And that
Hmm.
kind of conflicts with our fairness intuitions. And how does that arise in moral responsibility theory and in consequentialist accounts of moral responsibility? Well, if you think about it, I first started talking about what being held responsible does for the wrongdoer. Um, but then we moved broader and we had the moral community and we had the blamer themselves. And once you do that, and once you sort of allow a lot of different factors into what you might call the payoff or of blame,
Yeah.
and allow that to the justification, then the instrumentalization worry resurfaces, because it might be the case that the way you're blaming somebody, and let's not worry about whether they're actually blameworthy. Let's assume they are blameworthy. They sort of are in principle influenceable. But let's say the way you're blaming them is such that it's actually harmful for them because it undermines their self esteem or something. and because it's sort of spectacularly judgmental. But let's also assume that it's quite good at setting an example. We
Hmm.
go back to our classroom example. Let's assume that you have a teacher who's quite horrible to a student who's misbehaved and sort of publicly shames them in some way or other. And
Hmm.
so um, the instrumentalist hope is always that that's not going to work. Things will
Right.
magically align, right? And I think in the classroom case, that's actually reasonably promising because children have quite a strong sense of fairness, and if somebody's particularly horrible, then that's probably going to have other bad knock-on effects.
Right.
But it is the case, and that's sort of a second, but as you can see, closely intertwined worry about responsibility, instrumentalist responsibility, that any broadly consequentialist account, and in this case, a consequentialist account of moral responsibility, will sort of stand and fall with the empirical data on whether it works. And if it turns out that we would all be better people if we had a more therapeutic approach to blame and just calmly and reasonably told each other what we did wrong and no anger was involved, then it seems like at least the kind of blame that we have at the moment is no longer justified on the account. So that's a general worry, but you can then put that back to the instrumentalization worry, because I think it's a real possibility in the longer I work on this, and it's clearly question moral psychology more than philosophy, and then it feeds into the philosophical assessment, is whether
Hmm.
what benefits the individual is the same as what benefits the individual in terms of response. What benefits the individual is the same as what benefits the moral community in terms of reinforcing rules.
Right.
So I think there is a worry there, and I can give you. Have I got time for one more
Hmm.
example?
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
So I was worried about. Here's another nice case. Anybody remember the Spanish football? He wasn't the coach. I think he was the president of the Spanish Football Association, who kissed the player after they won the European Cup. Does that ring a bell?
I think
So
I heard about
grabbed
this.
her
Yeah.
face in both hands and kissed her, and then he got blamed a lot. And what happened, and I followed this quite closely because of
Okay.
my interest in blame. Um,
Right.
what happened is he dug in. He became extremely defensive, and his family supported him. And his mother wanted to go to a church, did go to a church on hunger strike because she felt he was unfairly treated. So what happened is that there was a lot of consensus in wider society that the behavior was unacceptable, but it didn't look like much was being done for his moral development, at least not in the short term. It's possible that 2 years down the line, this will have been an important learning experience. But certainly, when we look at the short term perspective, then it doesn't look like he learned. So, if you're an instrumentalist, then you kind of look at the community and the norm affirmation in the community, and your calculus comes out positive. You look at the individual and it's not so clear.
Hmm.
And maybe what that tells us is that that thing that I said earlier, that looking trying to calculate the consequences doesn't really work, and we just need a general principle. But it also raises the worry that what we hope to achieve for the individual may often not be possible through blame. And then we're kind of thrown back on the more general justifications, or thrown back on more retributive reactions. But
Right.
we don't want that, or at least I
Hmm.
don't want that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for giving us that example and for talking about this challenge you're still working on, thinking through. This has been a great conversation. If our listeners want to find more of your work, where can they go to find you online?
Yeah, I think probably the best places to go are either Phil Papers or my departmental website, because
Hmm.
we all end up with so many web presences that it's hard to keep them all up to date. But I think Phil
Right.
Yeah.
Papers updates automatically, and wherever possible, I will have a paper open access anyway, or put a preprint on as well, because that's obviously also a thing, right? You don't want to sort of know all the papers I've written that are then behind a paywall. So I think
Right.
Yeah.
it's maybe the way forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Thanks again. In our next season of the Free Will Show this fall, we will have a season on philosophical theology and free will.